Hey guys, I'm Molly Crabapple. I'm an artist and writer and the author of Drawing Blood over there. Today I'm here to introduce you to someone who has created something extraordinary. I'm here to introduce you to Wendy Pearlman, the editor of We Crossed the Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. Wendy Pearlman is a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Northwestern University who has been covering the Middle East for the last 20 years. And unlike the vast majority of Westerners who cover it, she speaks perfect Arabic. This book is the product of 300 interviews conducted since 2012 with Syrian refugees, from those living in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey to those who had made their way to Europe. It's an extraordinary work that, with poetry and passion and despair, tells the story of the Syrian Revolution and the Syrian War in the words of people who were affected by it. In the media, Syrians are most often portrayed as objects rather than subjects, as people who are talked about rather than people who speak. And Wendy's book does an extraordinary job at redressing this problem. It also does a sort of duty to history. Right now, as the Syrian war enters another phase, where it's most nakedly a proxy war between the states and where the initial revolutionary elements have largely been crushed, states have an intense motivation to rewrite the narratives about the Syrian war, to pretend that it was never a revolution, to pretend that it was always something else. Wendy's book does a duty to history. It shows the way that the Syrian revolution began. It shows the atrocities that the government carried out during pursuing the Syrian war, and for that alone, it's an extraordinary and precious document. And with that, I'd like to invite Wendy to read from her book.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction, including probably exaggerating the perfectness of my Arabic, but I will take it because it's a lifelong project, as those of you who study Arabic know. So thank you so much for having me. So the book is an oral history that we'll talk about more. The introduction is in my voice that lays out some basic context and facts about the Syrian conflict, its origins through to the present. But the rest is divided into 8 parts, and each of which consists entirely of a curation of testimonials, excerpts from these interviews that I did over many years, as Molly and I will talk about. So what I'd like to do then is read a few of these excerpts from across the book, from the beginning memories of history through the start of the revolution up to the present, just to give you some sense of that historical arc that the book covers and some sense of the feel of the voices that are presented. So I'll begin with a few from the first part of the book, which is titled Authoritarianism. Here are the words of Saleh, a landscaper from Dara. He said, "We don't have a government. We have a mafia. And if you speak out against this, it's off with you to Beit Khaltu, your aunt's house." That's an expression we have. It means to take someone to prison. It means forget about this person. He'll be tortured, disappeared. You'll never hear from him again. The next excerpt from Ilyas, a dentist from Rolhama. He said, "Syria had the appearance of being a stable country, but in my opinion, it wasn't real stability. It was a state of terror. Nobody trusted anyone else. Don't talk. The walls had ears. If anyone said anything out of the ordinary, others would suspect that he was a government informant, just trying to test people's reactions and gather a sense of what was going on. It was a regime based on command and obedience. Every state institution recreated the same kind of power. The president had absolute power in the country. The principal of a school had absolute power in the school. At the same time, the principal is terrified. Of whom? Of the janitor sweeping the floor, because they're all government informants. Also about authoritarianism, the words of Ayhan, a web developer from Damascus, who said, "The brainwashing process starts when you go to school. We love the leader, we love the regime. Without them, the country will collapse. You grow up with that in the back of your head, constantly reminding you that we are living due to the grace of the Assad family. But even as an innocent child, you see that the whole system just reeked. It fed on corruption and grew. If you want to get a passport, you have to bribe this guy and kiss that guy's ass, excuse my language. From when you're little, you're taught that this is the only way to survive in this country. As an active member of the ruling party, you're going to get better grades, better chances for better schools or jobs. Everything is handled by how loyal you are to the regime. So you're raised on the principle that you have to show your loyalty." From part 3 of the book titled Revolution, the words of Syrian, a mother from Aleppo. She said, "Oppression was residing in us. It was part of our life. Like air, sun, water, we didn't even feel it. Like air is there, and you never ask, where is the air? But then, in 1 second, in one shout, in one voice, you blow it up. You defy it and stand in front of death. You have an inheritance, and after 30 years, you slam it on the ground and shatter it. Don't even imagine that it was easy to go out to a demonstration. No amount of courage allows you just to stand there and watch someone who has a gun and is about to kill you. But still, this incredible oppression made us go out. I encouraged my nieces and nephews to come with me to demonstrations. I felt that if they didn't try that experience, they'd be missing the real meaning of life. When you chant, you shudder, and your body rises, and everything you imagined just comes out. Tears come down, tears of joy, because I broke the barrier. I am not afraid. I am a free being. Sadness and happiness and fear and courage, they're all mixed together in that voice, and it comes out strong." Another voice from the section Revolution, Rima, a writer from Sweden. She said, "I was in a demonstration, and I started to whisper, 'Freedom,' and then I started to hear myself repeating, 'Freedom, freedom, freedom,' and then I started shouting, 'Freedom!' I thought, this is the first time I have ever heard my own voice. And I told myself that I would never let anyone steal my voice again." From the next section, titled Militarization, the words of Captain, a fighter with the Free Syrian Army from Aleppo. He said, "When demonstrations began, security forces came. We agreed that if they were going to shoot bullets, then we needed weapons, too. We were only chanting in the streets. We could have chanted for the rest of our lives without anyone even paying attention to us. But when the regime started attacking us, a lot of people who were on the sidelines started to join and protest, too. Because of the blood. Blood is what moves people. Blood is the force of the revolution." From the section titled Living War, Abu Firas, also a fighter from Idlib. He said, "At first, 1 or 2 people were killed, then 20. Then it became normal. If we lost 50 people, we'd say, 'Thank God, it's only 50. It's been so long since I heard that someone died of natural causes." From part 7, titled flight. Hear the words of Talia, who went on to become a TV correspondent. And she said, "The night before I left was the longest night of my life. I was alone with the kids, and the planes were in the sky all night. The sound of planes is scarier than the sound of barrel bombs, because you hear them and wonder when the bombs will drop. The waiting is harder than the actual attack. I didn't know if we'd leave the next day, or if this would be the night that we died. I had seen children torn in pieces before, but I wasn't strong enough to see my own kids in that state. I needed to get them to safety. The kids woke up and I got them dressed. I got 2 pieces of paper and wrote our names and phone numbers and put them in their pockets. That way, if someone got killed, people would know their identities. I waited for the driver outside. I kissed the walls on the street because I knew that I was never coming back to them." From the final section of the book, titled Reflections, the words of Edom, a media organizer from Latakia. He said, "One of the most profound things that I've learned from this experience is that the process of finding out what a country needs is never clean. Of course, when you're in a stable country with functioning institutions, it's easy to have a moral code. But these values are only possible because other people did dirty things to put that system in place. We opened a Pandora's box. We had this innocent childlike interest to see what was inside the box. We thought we'd get a present, and what we got was all the evil in the world. Now we need to close the box again, but it's going to take a while. Now I'm working with an NGO that helps the free media inside Syria. I see my job as trying to support people who want to make their dreams come true. But I'm too old to dream now. In a month and a half, I'll be 29. Thank you.
That was incredible. The first thing that I wanted to ask you about is, could you talk about the process of collecting all of these interviews?
Yeah, thanks. I'd be happy to. So, should I sit or stand? I can do either. Maybe I'll stand just so people can see me. So so I began the process in 2012. So my interest began in 2011 when I sort of watching the Arab uprisings from afar. I'd written 2 books about the Palestinian national movement, studying the Middle East for over 20 years. So when the Arab uprisings began, I was captivated as a regional specialist, but probably like all of you or most people on the planet, where it was amazing, these shows of people's power. So I started following in Syria, especially because at that time many Syrians themselves and outside observers said, Syrians are not going to rise up. It's this kingdom of silence was the term used. Syrians are too afraid, the regime is too strong. Protests might go from one country to another in the Middle East, but Syrians are not going to have a revolution. So when Syrians also went out and protested with such enormous numbers and at such enormous risk, I felt like this was an amazing historic moment. And I wanted to know what it felt like. I wanted to know what motivated people. I wanted to know how it was transforming them. I wanted to know that personal experience of protesting. Because at the time I asked myself, would I have the courage to go out and protest? To risk my life, to know I could be beaten, I could be killed, I could be arrested? And I didn't know how to answer that question. I didn't know how to put myself in the shoes of people who were really risking their lives to go out and say no, to ask for a better system. So I decided I wanted to go and find out what that was like, and that there was no better way than to ask people for their stories. So that was sort of following over the year 2011, and 2012 was the first time that I had to begin sort of collecting these stories. And by that time, I myself was already too afraid to go into Syria to talk to people about protest and politics. So I thought the easiest, safest way for me and others was to talk to Syrians who were leaving the country. And that was sort of the beginning of what's now this epic Syrian refugee outflow. So I began in Jordan in 2012. I began with the names of 2 Jordanian journalists, who connected me to a Syrian friend of theirs, who then connected me to other people. And I spent about a month and a half sort of interviewing any displaced Syrian I could in Jordan. The interviews themselves were quite open-ended. Sometimes they were group discussions of several Syrian folks among themselves, sort of chatting and so forth, and I would have an audio recorder and catch the conversation. Sometimes there were these long personal testimonials where I would sit one-on-one with somebody from 20 minutes to 4 hours. Sometimes it continued over days. And I got hooked. The stories were so rich, and they weren't just stories about protest and conflict. They wove into stories about people's entire lives of living under authoritarianism for years or decades before 2011, and then all the details of what 2011 meant to them, and then what happened in their lives leading to the present. So as I got hooked, I knew that I needed to get more numbers and a larger range of Syrians, so I returned to Jordan the next summer, but then also moved on to Turkey, interviewing people who had wound up there, and that just continued for the next 4 years. So from 2012 to 2016, Jordan, Turkey, and then Lebanon, a little sort of side trip to the United Arab Emirates, and then as the large refugee flow went to Europe, continued on to Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, and did some interviews in the United States as well. So I collected and collected. Usually people gave me permission to audio record, which was fantastic, so that I can just sort of be in the moment of hearing someone's story and not have to worry about writing as fast as I could. And also then captured word for word what people were saying, because there's so much beauty in the exact way of expressing, not just the movingness of the stories people told, but the way of telling it. There was so much power in their own words. So I collected then hundreds of thousands of words of transcripts when I slowly got them transcribed and translated so they were on paper, and then became the question of, so what do I do with it? Because when I began, I didn't necessarily know it would be a book or what kind of book. I just thought, this is an historic moment and should be documented from the personal perspective of living these events. And then slowly came to the idea of, through many different drafts with different formats that didn't work as well, so some trial and error, to this format in which my role became a curator. My job was to choose an excerpt, because some of these interviews could be 20,000 words, and the whole book is about 50,000 words. So choosing a portion of an interview, my main job became the cutting, and then putting them in a sequence. And I like to think of it as like making a mosaic, in which each interview is sort of this precious rock, and I had to cut it so that the stone would sort of shine on its own, and then put them together in an order so that the sum was greater than the parts, that it told a joint story, a collective story, as well as each one being an individual story.
I thought you did an amazing job of that. I mean, the succinctness and the poetry of many of these anecdotes, it reminds me of the great Syrian writer Zakaria Tamer, who's known for his ultra short stories that are so full of like black wit and horror and wisdom. One of the things that I often think about when I'm reading about Syrian activists or the Syrian revolution in general, and particularly when I was reading the anecdotes in your book, is a quote by Albert Camus that I'm sure many of us know. Men of my generation had Spain in their hearts. It was there that they learned that one could be right and yet beaten, that force could vanquish spirit, and that there are times when courage is not rewarded. What is it like to read and compile these interviews, you know, at the distance of 6 years now since the start of the Syrian revolution?
Wow, thank you. It's a really powerful and apt quotation, I think, for this. And one is, I think, as time goes by, maybe people see the force. They see the outcome and forget the courage. I mean, I'll have to see the quotation again in terms of, they see the force and they see the vanquished and maybe forget the earlier moments. I mean, as time goes on, people say the Syrian war, the Syrian civil war, the Syrian refugee crisis. Less and less do we hear the Syrian uprising, the Syrian revolution. So part of what this book tries to do is preserve those memories of a popular uprising against authoritarianism, a popular call of ordinary people risking everything, sacrificing everything for freedom, for dignity, and then also put that uprising in its historical context. What exactly was the nature of the system that people were rising up against? So I hope it tells that a larger history that's always there, but in the sort of rush of everyday events, the rapid fire pictures of rubble and destruction and dead bodies and so forth, forget some of the earlier moments. So as I was saying, it begins with these stories of what life was like under Assad's authoritarian rule. Hafiz al-Assad came to power in 1970, and the people's memories of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, about silence, about intimidation, about security force rule, about a sense of having no accountability for abuses committed by those who were in power, a sense of futility, how will this regime ever change, what can be done, of corruption, endemic, systematic corruption, that those who had power were able to also have money and abuse it infinitely, and those who didn't, as is the opening line of the book, a drama student who says, a Syrian citizen is a number, dreaming is not allowed. So it paints a picture of this kind of world where many felt like, it's impossible to dream, what are you going to dream of? And then moves to these sections about the revolution, and it is like daring to dream. These small, tentative demonstrations, the way people begin watching events in Tunisia and Egypt, wondering will it happen here, slowly sort of pushing the boundaries to dream bigger and bigger, and then, as sort of alluded to in the parts I read, what it felt like and what it meant to people to go out and protest for the first time. People who maybe never even imagined that there could be mass protests, what a demonstration was like. And that was, for me, my most favorite part of the interviews I did, was to ask people, what was your first demonstration like? And you know, people, I had 60-year-old men with tears coming down their eyes, and you could see on a human level, imagining what it is like to go out and say no. And people would say things like, my first protest was like the first time I breathed, or the first time I said no, or the first time I felt like a real dignified human being. To claim that. That is what this revolution meant to those who supported it, who participated in it, who championed it. And then the regime responded to peaceful protests with violence. The opposition took up arms. It escalated to the horrible war and all the consequences we see today. And in that memory of the courage, the euphoria, the togetherness is increasingly buried. And I think that's a crime to those who went out. It's not just totally false and historic amnesia and a wrong way to know history and understand what's happened, but it is a dishonor to those who risked so much for such really true ideals.
Your first two books, Occupied Voices and Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement, are both about Palestinian resistance.
Yeah.
How did studying Palestine for so many years affect how you approached Syria?
Great, thank you. So my first book, I began studying the Middle East during a college semester abroad in Morocco, and then continued on, and eventually, Morocco was kind of the center of my world. Some of my college friends here might remember. And then I gradually was like, oh, the real action happens eastward. So I wound my way to Palestine, and I spent a semester there and got totally sort of hooked on the Palestinians from January to June 2000. I was in the West Bank, and then I continued going back for like the next 10 years or so. So I began my first book, Occupied Voices, sort of at the beginning. I just started my PhD studies. And it's also a book of interviews. So I think that Palestine probably taught me something, but also I early on got hooked on interviews and collecting personal stories as a really, really valuable way to understand politics. I mean, we all hear about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict all the time on the news. It's a constant source of news and events, and it's difficult, I think, for your average reader and news follower to even keep straight who the actors are and what's happened in the history and so forth. But having spent time there living with people and having colleagues and classmates and housemates and so forth who were Palestinian, I found there was something really special I learned about the experience of being Palestinian and the whole Arab-Israeli conflict by people's stories, their everyday life of how you get from one place to another, and whether there's water or electricity, and the memories of interactions with soldiers, or family stories. And in everyday lives, you could see the impact of politics, the impact of conflict and of war, the impact of a struggle and what it meant to people. So early on, I got a sense of personal stories as a way that not only showed sort of what was at stake in these conflicts, but also even a way of understanding what they're all about. So my first book was a book of interviews with Palestinians. The second one was a revision of my dissertation, so it's much more sort of heavy and academic. But I think then, as the Syrian conflict began, I returned to that kind of roots of personal stories can show something about conflict that can help us understand, but also know why it matters. But otherwise, I think that I've had this long sort of interest, I think probably from my studies of the Palestinians, of protest, of social movements, of an understanding of how difficult it is to get collective action off the ground, of how difficult it is to unify a struggle, what it means to be up against a foe who is in many ways more powerful, the resilience over years or generations, maybe, that it takes to continue struggling for goals when they're not achieved. One maybe sadder thing is that a huge aspect of the Palestinian reality is being a refugee diaspora. When I began studying the Syrian conflict, I never thought about it in refugee terms. I started interviewing Syrian refugees, not because they were refugees, but because they were Syrians, and many of them expected to go home at any moment in 2012. People had their bags packed, or didn't even have bags. I remember having interviews with these young guys who were like, I don't think I'm going to buy a can opener here in Turkey because, I have a can opener back home and I'm not going to be here for very long. It was that sense of any day we're going to go back. And over the years, I've watched many of those displaced, almost like I've come to sort of like being a refugee is a process more than an event, slowly begin to feel like maybe they're not going home anytime soon. There's still that dream, but life goes on. So I didn't begin my study of Syria thinking that my contact with Palestinian refugees might give me insight into Syria, but I think increasingly now there's a refugee dimension which is of salience independent of the issue of the conflict and the uprising itself. So there are lots of parallels and things to dig in there, I think, for insight and for understanding.
Right now, there is a concerted effort to erase a lot of the origins of the Syrian war, to erase a lot of crimes done by the Syrian government, and to erase a lot of the activity that you were speaking of, the revolutionary activity. There's a state-funded effort to pretend that the Syrian revolution never existed, that the people protesting the government were always members of Al-Qaeda, were always terrorists. And by the same token, there's also a fatigue that sets in when people in the West see so much death, and where they want to forget about it and turn their eyes away, and certainly not look at protests, or not look at people's courage, to just say, oh, this is dead bodies, this is dead children, and that's it, and then look away. How do you feel this book, that is people's personal stories, can counteract those two narratives?
Wow. Yeah, it brings back to the nuts and bolts. So I love the stories that really talk about how the uprising got off the ground. That if now there's a sense of the terrorist gangs or West. I had a talk yesterday in which a student said, so was the CIA really there funding demonstrations from the beginning? How do you know? So yeah, I sense of in any way this kind of revisionism of it was Islamic extremists from the beginning, or Al-Qaeda from the beginning, or outside interveners from the beginning, and not a genuine grassroots uprising. But the stories that people told about how they first came to participate in protests, or how those protests got off the ground, are so grassroots. I mean, when people walked me through the nuts and bolts of the decision, hour by hour, day by day, it was almost a miracle that demonstrations got off the ground. I mean, I remember some young people telling me, like for every demonstration that succeeded, there were 500 that failed. And there are stories about someone hearing, oh, a demonstration is supposed to start at one mosque, and he went to that mosque, and he got stood up and said, you know, something to get the protest going, and everyone looks at him like, no, it's the other mosque. I mean, and so he like kind of walks away. He's like, Allahu Akbar, and people are like, and he sort of slinks away. And there's a story of well, someone tells a story of someone who went from a protest and people are singing and chanting and singing and dancing, and he locks arms on the right with someone and locks arms on the left, and they're walking along, and then those two people slowly guide him to a police car because they're undercover agents who were there, and then he went off to be arrested. There's another person who was arrested by the secret police, and they said, you were in demonstrations, and he was like, I was not in demonstrations, I swear, and they show him a video of him at a demonstration, and he's singing and chanting, and he's on the shoulders of someone who turns out to be the interrogator, who's like, oh, you weren't there? So, I mean, there was that littered with danger. People talk, and then another person who was a media activist himself filming videos of demonstrations, because there was either this sort of rhetoric of the demonstrations are all terrorist gangs or they're not happening at all. So people also risked their lives to film them, to document them, to show that they were real, to smuggle that film coverage out to satellite television channels so it would circulate and so forth. And one of the media activists who was in charge of, or his town was doing a lot of the filming, that even the other demonstrators were fearful that maybe he was filming because he was working for the secret police. So he said he always went to the back of the demonstration, so you only got people's from the back of their heads and didn't get faces, but could you still get some sense of the crowd. So you see that the sheer ingenuity that it took. I mean, there's sections of the book in which people talk about how they were afraid to talk on the phone and talk about demonstrations because maybe the phones would be tapped. So instead used code and speaking, and nearly everybody said this, that people would say, hi mom, like, has the bread arrived? Are you having a party? Is it foggy? This entire wet, you know, and those of you who were there remember, like, is it foggy? Is it raining? Has the party started? I mean, people used code to say, like, demonstrations, has the security forces arrived, is there shooting, and so forth. Like, that was the level of care. And then once there were real reprisals and there were curfews and cities were sealed off, how people worked together to smuggle in bread or smuggle in medicine or help each other, neighbors, and so forth. So much tremendous and truly grassroots work on the individual level, the level of the apartment, the neighborhood, and so forth. What it took to get this off the ground. There's another great story. I don't think it actually made it into the book of when there was a call on Facebook for the revolution to begin on March 15th. That everyone should have demonstrations on March 15th, and people in the sort of the southern town of Dera, where ultimately there were mass protests that were really critical, talked about how they were going to have a protest on March 15th, and people talked that they should have a demonstration outside the courthouse. And one man said, you know, that was the idea. So we walked to the courthouse and find the plaza outside the courthouse just filled with police officers. Somehow had gotten word. And he said, we walked by and we didn't even stop. We just walked to the courthouse and just went walking on our way as if we were just on a walk to go to the grocery store. And then 3 days later, there happened to be a mass demonstration there, which still was so contingent, could have been stopped or blocked or derailed on so many levels. So people worked so hard, pulled together their resources, and had such sheer level of courage to make this happen, to now look back and say, oh, it was a CIA plot. It was funded or fomented from the outside, that it had some sort of radical agendas, is just such a, thank you for being here, such a complete misunderstanding. It's slanderous, you know, of history. So that is just, and when you get those personal stories, you see that contingency, that hesitation, that miracleness of it, that blows any sort of larger conspiracy theory just out of the water. It's totally out of sync with the stories of people who were there and lived this, and who made it by doing what they did. So that's one end of the narrative. I guess the other narrative is sort of now just the destruction and the death and the violence, which is very, very real. And I guess the problem there is a people's sense of where does that violence and war come from? It just didn't come from nowhere. These aren't refugees who were just all of a sudden bombs started falling and they fled as if suddenly there's a war. there's a war that's an outgrowth of an attempt to oppress a popular uprising that has escalated in the horrible ways we see. So that all the death and destruction is real, and it's just meant even more pain too. I mean, all of that horror, that loss, that violence, that death would be horrible under any circumstances. It's horrible on its own. But the fact that it is also coming from an attempt to oppress a popular uprising that called for change and accountability, it's just, I think, it's another level of pain and horror, and another level of intensity of why we should be so outraged with what's happening, and all act in solidarity, not just to end a war, but to remember the goals and the struggle of those that started what became the war that is today.
The book stops, I believe, around 2015, when during the mass movement of refugees. As of now, the war has become ever more proxy war. Turkey has invaded Idlib. America has destroyed about 90% of Raqqa with bombs, and it's currently being held by the SDF. The Assad government has taken Deir ez-Zor. So, at this moment, what sort of stories do you think would be told if you're adding another chapter to your book?
Wow, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the interviews that went into the book went up to 2016. So it's really the 2015 wave to Europe, and then I was able to sort of a year later maybe get the beginnings of some of these refugees in Europe, the beginnings of their life in exile. So in many ways, I mean, the arc of the book goes from authoritarianism, revolution, militarization, repression, living war, flight, and then reflections. So I think it would be expanding that living war chapter, which could go on forever in terms of more and more stories of war, of suffering, of bombardment, of hunger. There are stories of people in starvation in areas that have been put under siege and couldn't even access food. It's just the litany of horrors, of atrocities, of real crimes against humanity. There's stories of people who've been in prison and tortured in prison and so forth. So I think for the experience of civilians, it's in some ways captured that feel of what living war might be like for a civilian who's forced to live under war conditions. And in some ways would just be an indication of, and it's still going on, and it's still more and more. I mean, I think the stories now coming out of Raqqa and the bombing there, and the picture of utter and complete destruction. There might be that some of the stories in the book are similar in character, and that's would just add another level of intensity. But the stories of war, I think, would be variations on that theme. And then meanwhile, if we're continue to push forward into the future in terms of refugee stories, it's that life moves forward, and people still struggle with this question of will we go home or not go home, but meanwhile, how do we push our lives forward wherever we are, for our children, for ourselves, whether it's in work or personal aspirations and the life cycle and so forth. So there's that story of exile for those who've left, as well as the story of just ever increasing misery for those who are inside. And maybe if there'd be another chapter, is this, so when is this going to end, and under what conditions will it end, and maybe under what conditions would people be willing to accept simply to have the relief of an end to violence. As every year goes on, that accumulation of suffering and utter fatigue and exhaustion for people who've now had more than 6.5 years of their lives lost to this violence, that I think becomes an increasing question for people of what would you accept simply to have the relief, the respite of violence be over.
How are your friends and sources doing now?
Yeah, thanks. It's the whole variety. So for thanks to Facebook, I'm still in touch with as many people as I can be. There were some people with whom I had very brief encounters. I never even got their real name, and I can only wonder how and where they are now. But for many, many people, I'm still in touch. And one thing that's been interesting is that people have not only, there's Syrians whose lives are intimately intertwined with the Syrian conflict and living the conflict, and the conflict is their life and their life is the conflict. But people have also had the regular life cycle of being people. That there are a lot of, I met a lot of interviews with young guys sort of in their mid-20s or early 20s, activists who lived and breathed revolution for several years, and I met them in 2012 or 2013. As I got to know them over the years, many of these guys said, you know, I want to get married. I want to have kids. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, you're a human being too. You're not just a revolution machine. And now many of them are married, and some of them have children, and maybe some have moved from Turkey and Lebanon to Sweden and Germany, and they're learning new languages, and they're providing for their kids. And a very large part of their heart is still in Syria, and they're still checking the news, you know, continually, and they're worried about their families who are there, or their families who are scattered, or the family members who've been arrested and disappeared. But they also have moved on to different stages of their life. So that's been a real joy for me, is to watch people move on to a different stage of their lives, especially that sort of the young cohort that are now becoming parents of their own and have new aspirations and new. And in many ways, new sources of joy, which is a thrill to hear, because there's so much pain. At least having babies brings people joy, or at least I've heard. So that's one thing. But then, especially those who have moved on to Europe, but others are still, still suffering tremendously. The situation, especially among the poorest of the poor in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, is just atrocious. I mean, it's estimated like hundreds of thousands of children are working in Turkey. It's sometimes 12, 13-hour shifts in factories or in agriculture, and are not going to school, and you can only wonder what's going to happen to them and their families. They might be supporting their whole family on the wages of 8 or 9 or 10-year-olds who are working in the fields all day long. The people I visited in Lebanon in these informal tent settlements, because there aren't officially recognized refugee camps, people just sort of put up tents in an open field, which don't even as horrible as refugee camps are. At least the critical mass allows maybe for a clinic or a school. But when you have 20 tents in a field where people are paying an absentee landlord by the meter, it's just, the situation is absolutely dire. So there are little glimpses of joy, especially I think in the familial realm, but there's also overwhelming sadness. And this nostalgia I think people have for Syria that people are afraid no longer exists, and they're really tremendously pained sorts of ways people grapple with the kinds of contradictions of, you know, even those who've made it to Europe. There's, you know, even I think some words in the book of a doctor who's totally made it. He has now been certified by the board of orthopedic surgeons of the state of Germany. This doctor from Homs is doing tremendously well. And he will say, because now I've seen him many years, I met him in Jordan, and now saw him in Berlin maybe a couple of months ago, saying, you know, like, my heart, it breaks with the contradiction of the comfort I have here in the heart of Europe and what people are suffering back home. So that's the indication of even those who have made it and you think, wow, this is kind of the greatest success story, carry so much pain, sometimes even carry a sense of guilt. Why am I alive and so many people aren't? Why am I doing well and so many people are not? So happiness and hope for the family and the children, but also this pain. It's this total web of so much hope and loss and difficulty that I think it's really difficult to understand what, I can't understand what it's really like to feel it. But I think that people try to be happy but are never 100% happy. And there's always something tugging. That's kind of the burden, what I imagine be the burden of being a Syrian human being on planet Earth at this time. Someone was just telling me the other day, you know, there's no such thing as a happy Syrian. You were told, you know, no such thing as or 100% happy Syrian. Maybe you could be happy at sometimes and joke and so forth, but no Syrian. I don't know any Syrians in the room can relate to that as 100% happy Syrian. And that's hard, I think, for those of us who have not experienced war, to really imagine that there's always something you can't quite forget, you can't fully put out of your mind. That's the burden that people, all, rich and poor, you know, relatively okay or not at any age live with that, carry that pain with them, I think now.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
So I'm going to open